Good monitoring is essential for running any kind of application in production. So that is why in this lesson, I will show you how to connect our DevHabit API to Application Insights, which we already enabled on our Azure App Service. Application Insights is an APM tool, which stands for Application Performance Monitoring, but it can also do much more. For example, in the current setup where we enable Application Insights for our Azure App Service, it's going to automatically be added to the app service at runtime and is going to start picking up useful information that you can observe in the Azure portal. However, we can also configure it to work with OpenTelemetry, which we were using the entire time we were building our DevHabit REST API. So that's how I want to configure it as part of this lesson. I'll show you how to connect Application Insights with our existing OpenTelemetry setup, and then I will show you how it's being used in production. If I go into Visual Studio and open up the DevHabit API project, what I need to do next is install an additional NuGet package. And the NuGet package that I want to install is Azure Monitor OpenTelemetry ASP.NET Core. Let me go ahead and install the latest version of this library. And with this library installed, let's go into our code. And where we are configuring observability is in the add observability method. Now here we're configuring the OpenTelemetry exporter, which we use to export our traces, metrics, and logs into either Seek or the Aspire dashboard. So what I want to do here is, after configuring my tracing, metrics, and logs, is access the environment on my web application builder. And here I can check if this is the development environment. Then I want to say builder services add OpenTelemetry, and I'm going to add back the statement for using the OpenTelemetry exporter. Otherwise, if this is not the development environment, then I want to use Application Insights. And I can do this by saying builder services add OpenTelemetry, and I'm going to say use Azure Monitor. This is going to configure exporting our telemetry data into Azure and is going to make it available inside of Application Insights. Now we don't have to do anything additional because everything is already configured in Azure. I'll show you what I mean in just a moment. But if you were setting this up manually, then you'd need to provide the connection string to your Application Insights instance. I'll go ahead and deploy this from Visual Studio, and then I will jump into the Azure portal. I'll navigate to the DevHabit API app service, and I want to go into Settings and then Environment Variables. And here you'll be able to see that we already have the Application Insights connection string configured, as well as the Application Insights agent. So these two environment variables were added when we enabled Application Insights for this app service. Now, if you're doing this manually, you'll have to configure all of this yourself. However, with this setup in place and the Azure Monitor exporter that we just deployed, we have everything we need to wire up OpenTelemetry and our Application Insights resource. Now, if you go into Monitoring and then Application Insights, you'll be able to navigate to your Application Insights resource. And here you can start seeing some telemetry data about your application. For example, I can see if I have any failed requests, what is the server response time. You can also see the server requests, availability, and from the sidebar, you also have a couple of interesting options. The application map is going to show you your application and the other services that it's connecting to. For example, you can see I'm connecting to my Postgres database and the GitHub API, and then you have an option to drill down into this and find out more details. And one interesting thing that Application Insights does is it highlights any problems. Now, what I want to show you is the live metrics, and this is going to allow us to observe our metrics in real time. So let me jump into the client application, and I'm going to load the dashboard where you can see I have a lot more activities because my integration with GitHub is working correctly, and the background job picked up my habit, reached out to my GitHub account to fetch the latest events. So now you can see I have a lot of additional entries present in the user interface, and I can keep loading more from the backend if I want to. This is using cursor pagination behind the scenes. I can also load my tags, I can load my habits, I can go into the individual habit or the other one and back to the dashboard, and I'm just doing this to generate a couple of API requests. Now let's add a few automatic entries. You can see this is taking a bit slower, but now it's pretty fast. And if I go into the entries, then here are the manual entries that I created. And now if I go back into the Azure portal, we should be able to see a lot of interesting details in the live metrics. Now you can also see additional details from here, and this contains the live traces from your application. So I can jump into a specific trace, let's say the first one here, and then bring up the trace details where I can see additional telemetry data. You may not be able to see all of the details because my face is obscuring it, but essentially this contains a live stream of traces from our application. Now, if you want to see more details, you can go into the monitoring and then logs, and I will close down this pop-up. And what we can do here is select the traces inside of our application. So I'm going to run a query to find all of the traces in the last hour. So let's run this, and we get back a list of results containing our application traces. So here you can again see the database commands that we are executing on our database. You can drop down a particular trace to see the trace details, and it also contains any custom data that we are including. For example, I'm adding the user identifier of the current user as part of my traces so that I can more easily debug problems if I run into them. Now, one more thing I want to show you is the performance section. So let's go into there. And here you can find any problematic requests that you are sending to your application. And you also have the ability to drill down and see more details. So let's say we go into the requests to our habits resource. Then we can see the details for these requests. And it's also going to give you a couple of samples if you want to drill down and see more details. So now you can see the logs from our application, and you can take a look into any requests that were slower than usual, like this one here, which took almost 16 seconds. So now I can jump into this trace and see what took so long to execute. So for example, this is my trace, and you can see that the API request itself took 16 seconds, and then my database requests were actually pretty fast. So you can see 250 milliseconds to select the current user from our database. Then we have another query which is doing the count, and then we have another query doing the select with offset and limit operators. So this is actually our pagination query, which ended up being pretty quick. So from this, you can figure out that most of the blame is on the application server, which took more than 10 seconds to send an initial request to our database. And this is mainly because our application was still starting up, so we ended up with a slow request. If I go back to the performance section and I filter out the operations to contain GitHub, you can see the request that we are sending to fetch the user's profile. Now these are a bit more interesting because they are also reaching out to the GitHub API. So if I drill down into this one here, we can see how long it took to reach out to the GitHub API, and our GET request completed in 800 milliseconds. So this is just a quick demo of how you could use Application Insights for monitoring your application. What I showed you here was the performance section. Let me also show you how to see the application logs. So what I showed you previously were traces, but if I replace this with requests, and we try to see what we had in the last hour, you should see a stream of logs representing the request being sent to our API. So I can take a look at this request here for the GitHub profile endpoint, and I can dig into the details to see if there's anything interesting. You can also see the other request to fetch the user's profile to get the statistics, and you will see a mix of logs coming from our application and OpenTelemetry, but also the automatic instrumentation from Application Insights that is built into the App Insights service. We only scratched the surface of application monitoring, but introducing Application Insights gives you a lot of options and flexibility when it comes to figuring out what is the current state of your application. It's also good at highlighting any potential problems so that you can drill down further and figure out how to solve it. Now, if you want to learn more about this topic and also any alternatives, I'm going to leave some useful resources under this video, and we can move on to our next lesson where I'm going to show you how we are going to automate our deployments using GitHub Actions.